Jessica.
No worries at all. Good morning, everyone. I have to say before I start a formal introduction that this is super exciting for me. This is a scholar whose work I've read for years, I've cited for years, I've taught for years. So I'm gonna just have like a moment geeking out over how cool this is. Dr. Diana Hess began her education career as a high school social studies teacher in Downers Grove, Illinois in 1979. During her time there, she became president of the Downers Grove Teachers Union. She then went on to work as the associate director of the Constitutional Rights Foundation in Chicago from 1987 to 1995. Hess earned her PhD in 1998 from the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Washington, Seattle, with extensive coursework in educational policy and law. In 2018, she received the University of Washington College of Education's 2018 Distinguished Alumnus Award. Since 1997, Hess has been researching how teachers engage their students in discussions of highly controversial political and constitutional issues and what impact this approach to civic education has on what young people learn. Her first book on this topic, Controversy in the Classroom, The Democratic Power of Discussion, won the National Council for the Social Studies Exemplary Research Award in 2009. Her most recent book, The Political Classroom, Evidence and Ethics in Democratic Education, which I have right here, co-authored with Paula McAvoy, won the AERA Outstanding Book Award in 2016 and the prestigious Grawemeyer Award in 2017. Also in 2017, Hess was recognized by the NCSS with the Graham's Distinguished Career Award for Research. So as you can see, Dr. Hess is deeply committed to working with teachers to improve the quality of democratic education in schools, a topic most of us would argue is more important now than ever before. And I want to thank the website, oops, sorry guys, from the College of Education at Wisconsin for helping me to develop that bio that I read for you this morning. It is my true pleasure to introduce you to our keynote PCSS speaker, Dr. Diana Hess.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I really appreciate the introduction, and I so appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you. I have a lot of friends in Pennsylvania. In particular, I've done a lot of work with David over the years, and my good friend Steve Klein, who taught in Pennsylvania and then came to work with me at the Constitutional Rights Foundation, has had a huge effect on how I think about teaching social studies. So what I'd like to do today is start by sharing my screen. Which for some reason, there we go. And begin by saying that I'm going to be talking about the challenges of teaching for democracy in a time of political climate change. And I know that the label political climate change is a little bit odd. So to explain that, let me begin by just reminding us of what environmental climate change looks like. And as you can see here, environmental climate change has happened over time, quite dramatic, and as we know from research, is caused by human behavior. And so too is political climate change. And by political climate change, what I mean is that the political climate that we are living in now is dramatically different than it was, I would say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And for the most part, with some exceptions, I would argue that the differences are not positive ones. And I want to begin by talking about why we have seen political climate change and really what it means. And I think a lot of it is rooted in the levels of political polarization that we see in the United States. A book that I would really recommend to you is The Big Sort by Bill Bishop. And in this book, Bill Bishop talks about the tendency of people in the United States to cluster geographically in like-minded communities. And Bill Bishop and other political science researchers argue that this clustering of like-minded people is, for the most part, not a good thing, because what it produces is a level of political polarization that many scholars argue is more extreme and worse than we've seen in the United States for over 100 years. And I want to give you a sense of how political polarization has developed geographically. So to begin with, in just a minute, I'm going to show you a map of the United States. And this map will move through time. And what it shows is how counties are becoming increasingly politically homogenous, and therefore elections are becoming increasingly uncompetitive. So here's the United States in 1992. And just to walk you through what this means, the parts of the United States that are very red are places in which the majority of voters who voted in 1992 voted for the Republican candidate. The parts of the United States that are depicted here as blue in a similar way are places where a majority of people who voted in 1992 voted for the Democratic candidate. And as you notice here, there are vast parts of the country that are neither blue nor red. And what that means is that in those places, there really was a lot of ideological difference as represented by the mix in how people voted. Now let's take a look at how this has changed over time. So here we have 1996, 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012, and finally 2016. And I would argue that this change has been obviously very fast. I mean, this happens, just since 1992. And it also, when you look at this map, seems a little bit odd. And another way of making it appear even more odd is to look at it in another way. This is the 2016 election. And what you can see is in the areas that are red, that meant more than 70% of those who voted for the Republican candidate for president. The blue areas, 70% Democratic. And you can see, but you have to look really hard, that there are some purple areas. And those purple areas, or what we often call, purple cities or purple counties or purple precincts or purple states even, are places in which there was more of an ideological mix as represented by how people voted. Now, when you look at this map, I know you think, oh, I don't know what you think, but one thing you might think is what I thought when I first saw it is like, this doesn't look right, because this map makes it appear that the United States is predominantly a red country. And we know that's not true. We know that, especially in the 2016 election, it was extremely close. Now, if we adjust this map by population, which is I'm going to do in just a moment, we'll see the explanation for that. So here is the map that is correcting for population. And with this map, what you can see is that the coasts tend to be more blue, that the interior of the United States tends to be more red. And obviously we've got a huge rural urban divide going on as well. So what does that mean, and what is that caused by? Well, one thing that we know from political science research is that people in the United States are becoming increasingly partisan. And by that, I mean they're more ideologically firmed up. They're much more likely to say on virtually every issue, they have a view that aligns with one or another of the political parties. And if we look to the right, we can see that the partisanship of people has caused them to be more likely to vote. Whereas if you look at the left of this map, going all the way back to 1952, while there was a difference, the difference wasn't as extreme. So in a nutshell, what this meant is that in the past, it was more likely that people were less likely to be strong partisans. And being a strong partisan didn't have such a dramatic effect on predicting whether people are going to vote. So not surprisingly, if people are more likely to vote because they are strong partisans, they're also more likely to do what Bill Bishop demonstrated in the book Big Sort, which is to move to be close to people who are ideologically similar to them, and we're much more likely to see this extreme political polarization. And what we know is that this geographic polarization and the polarization represented by the relationship between partisanship and voting has also caused something that we call affective polarization, which means, in a nutshell, what your attitude is about people who are politically different than you. And if we look at these data, we can see that going back to 1994, there really weren't that many people in the United States who said that they had a negative or unfavorable attitude about the political party that was different than the one that they might align with. But by 2016, that was really quite dramatic. Here on both sides of the political fence, so to speak, we've got a solid majority of people who say that they really don't think that the other political party is one that deserves anything like a positive attitude. And it gets even more dramatic when asked this question: is the other political party literally a threat to the nation's well-being? And what you can see is that just 4 years ago, close to a majority of people said yes. Now think about what that means for a democracy. It's one thing to say, I disagree with the political views that are represented by a party that's different than the one that I typically vote for. But it's another thing to say that that party is literally illegitimate, because when you're saying that something is a threat to the nation's well-being, you're really saying that the legitimacy of those views are to be questioned. And the consequences of this are pretty extreme. A second book that I would recommend to you is Hearing the Other Side by Diana Mutz. And what Diana Mutz has shown in her research is that we've got this interesting political conundrum in the United States, that people who live in politically diverse communities are more tolerant for political difference, but less likely to participate politically. Comparatively, people who live in politically like-minded communities are more likely to participate politically, but less likely to be tolerant of political difference. And for the schools, I would argue, this creates what I call the political education paradox, which is, on the one hand, because we're living in such a politically polarized environment, there's a need to teach young people how to participate politically in such an environment. Because in fact, I would argue, and I hope you agree with me, that we want young people to participate politically, and that that is part of what we should be working for in schools. On the other hand, we expect schools to do this in a way that doesn't make them partisan spaces. So for example, it would just sound, to me anyway, bizarre to say, well, Central High School is a Democratic school and West High School is a Republican school and Northeast South High School is a green school or whatever. It just doesn't ring right, because we expect schools to be places where there are multiple and competing political views. And yet we have this challenge. How do you prepare young people to be political participants in this very polarized world? At the same time, we keep to what we need to keep to, I would argue, which is both do political education and do it in a way that doesn't cause the school to become a partisan space. So about a month ago, again on a Saturday, the School of Education here at UW-Madison sponsored a conference for K-12 teachers called Teaching About the Elections. And part of the swag for the conference was a t-shirt, which this year we had to mail to people, that on the front says, "Teach like democracy depends on it." And I want to now talk for just a little bit about my views about the relationship between what we do in schools and the kind of democracy that we're trying to create. As Jessica mentioned, a few years ago, I co-authored a book called The Political Classroom, Evidence and Ethics in Democratic Education with my good friend and colleague, Paula McAvoy. And in the political classroom, we were exploring one central question, which is how do we teach young people in schools how to deliberate what I would argue is the central democratic question of all time, which is simply, how should we live together? And one approach to doing that is to engage young people in discussions and deliberations of controversial political issues, which are unresolved questions of public policy that spark significant disagreement. And such issues require a decision about which policy is the best response to a particular problem. So one of the things that Paul and I were interested in when we were doing the research that resulted in the political classroom book is what happens in classes where teachers are engaging students in discussions of these controversial political issues compared to classes where that's not happening. Specifically, we had 3 research questions that animated this study. The first was, what do high school students experience and learn from participating in social studies courses that emphasize the deliberation of controversial political issues? The second question was whether or not such deliberations influence students' political and civic participation after they leave high school. And the third question is, how should teachers make good professional judgments when teaching controversial political issues, especially about the ethical questions that teachers encounter when doing this kind of work? So for example, one ethical question that is certainly not a new one is, when I'm teaching my students how to participate in a controversial political issue discussion, do I withhold or share my own views on the issue that we are discussing? Another question that we were interested in is, how do teachers determine what's a controversial issue in the first place, compared to what's a question for which there's a settled answer that we want to teach students to build and believe? A third question that we encountered was, are there some controversial political issues that are so sensitive for some students that they shouldn't be brought into the classroom? Well, wrapped around all 3 of these questions, we were really interested in teachers' practice. What do teachers do who are really good at teaching students how to participate in these discussions, compared to what do teachers do who are less skilled, or what do teachers do who are not doing this at all? And to do this study, we went into 3 states, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. And in those states, we found teachers, as you can see, 35 of them in 21 different schools, who were teaching young people how to deliberate in controversial political issues, or teachers in those same schools who were teaching similar classes, but not including issues. Now, as you can see, the states that we were in were very different politically at the time, and still are today. Illinois was a predominantly blue state, although those of you who know or have lived in Illinois, like Steve Klein, know that Illinois is a very ideologically disparate state. There are parts of Illinois that are very, very blue. There are parts of Illinois that are very, very red. In a similar fashion, Indiana was at the time, and is today, more of a red state, but it also has political differences throughout. And Wisconsin was at the time, and is today, like Pennsylvania, a very purple state, which is why your state and the state that I currently live in are called battleground states. Now, the schools that we were in were very different from one another. Some of them were urban public schools, some were charter schools, some were suburban, large public high schools, some were small rural schools. We had private schools and public schools. We had sectarian and non-sectarian schools. It really was, I think, an incredibly good mix of schools. And one of the things we were interested in was, what relationship is there between the ideological makeup of the community that the school was housed in and what was happening in the classes? And to that end, one thing we did was survey the students at the beginning and end of each class. And we also surveyed their teachers. So here we are in Ms. Heller's class. Ms. Heller was a social studies teacher at the time in a suburban school that was about 40 miles outside of a large city. And in that school, she engaged her students in a semester-long legislative simulation that not only her classes, but all of the classes that taught seniors engaged students in. This was really a remarkable form of political education. And if you're interested in reading more about it, there's a chapter about Ms. Heller and how she taught this political simulation in the book, The Political Classroom. Well, we asked the students, if you had been old enough to vote in the most recent presidential election, for whom would you have voted? And as you can see, the students who are colored in blue here said they would have voted for the Democratic candidate. The students who are colored in red said they would have voted for the Republican candidate. And this one lone student on the right was undecided. We also asked questions about a whole host of controversial political issues. Now, we didn't ask them framed this way. We framed them as questions, not as topics. So for example, the death penalty question was, in our state, should the death penalty be legal or illegal? So what we did then was to look at the students' responses based on the extent to which they lined up with more red or more blue political ideas, more Democratic or more Republican. And as you can see, Ms. Heller, I would argue, hit the ideological jackpot because she had a class that was incredibly diverse. And diverse classes are like the mother's milk of deliberation. If you have a diverse class, it means you've got authentically occurring differences of opinion. And as you can see, what this looks like is that there is just a whole lot of difference. There are some students, both on the left and the right of the screen, who are pretty ideologically lined up. So you can see the one student to the far left on every issue but one, this student was progressive. You can see on the far right that we have a student who looks a little bit similar, although many of the students, most, have internal ideological differences. And all of these students who have a square that's gray have an issue or issues for which they are undecided or don't know. As an aside, one of the things that Paul and I learned is that the more gray squares, the better the discussion. And the reason for that is that students who are undecided or don't know do something that students who are decided don't do, which is they ask authentic questions. And authentic questions in deliberations are really good things. Let's go to another class. This is Mr. Kushner's class. Mr. Kushner was teaching in a high school about the same size as Ms. Heller's, but it was located in a college community that was and is one of the most left-leaning communities in the United States. As a matter of fact, the 3 precincts that feed into Mr. Kushner's school were at the time of the study, the 3 bluest precincts in the entire United States. So as you can see, when Mr. Kushner's students said who they would have voted for, they all lined up. And the map looks very, very different than Ms. Heller's class. It's much bluer, although there still is some ideological difference. And the reason I think this map is really instructive is that if you looked just at the top, you would think, oh my gosh, there's no way we're going to get really good political discussion in this class unless we do a lot to make sure that we're inserting points of view that are not authentically represented. But in fact, that was not the case because both Mr. Kushner had realized that there were all sorts of things that he needed to do to get alternative views in class. But Mr. Kushner knew that even though it would appear that all the students were ideologically similar, when you really get underneath the overall question of who they think they would have voted for, there was more political difference. And certainly there's a lot of gray here. So let's look at this as it relates to Mr. Walters' class. Mr. Walters taught in a small evangelical Christian high school where both students and their parents had to sign a statement saying that they had been ideologically saved in order to get into the school. And even in Mr. Walters' class, where we expected as researchers that we would see many, many more right-leaning students, there was a degree of political difference that was certainly more than Mr. Kushner's, but less than Ms. Heller's. So what difference does all of this make? Well, two things in particular. What we found was that in virtually every class, there was some degree of ideological difference that was more than you would expect if you just looked at the overall political orientation of the community. And we learned, and we talk about it in detail because there are chapters on each of these three teachers in the political classroom, that these teachers had to do different things in order to get high quality discussion. Ms. Heller had to make sure that she really focused a lot on civility norms, because even though there was a lot of naturally occurring political difference, because of that difference, it was easy for her students to think that that their views were right and that they did not need to speak with one another civilly. Ms. Heller was an excellent teacher. She was able to establish a classroom climate in this classroom. And I would argue this was happening throughout this really remarkable school, where students learned that it was really important to treat one another with respect, even though they had quite different political views. So in a nutshell, what did we learn from the study about why it's important to teach students to discuss controversial political issues? Well, one thing we learned is that in all sorts of ways, students were learning things that, when extrapolated, should have the effect of strengthening US democracy. We also learned that in high quality discussions, students were really engaged, that students liked the discussions, and that when we talked to them 2 and 4 years after high school, we learned that they had a huge amount of respect for the teachers in the study who were really good at teaching them how to engage with other students who had politically disparate views. We learned that the discussions helped students learn important political content. We learned that the schools were diverse public spaces in ways that we didn't expect. We learned that it was possible to both have political difference and develop tolerance. And we learned that high quality discussion influenced political engagement. The schools and teachers that had the highest quality discussion, we called these best practice classes, got the strongest effects. And in those classes, here's what we saw. There were no spontaneous discussions, that the discussions were discussions in which both the students and the teachers were really well prepared, that the discussions involved a lot of student talk that was not always mediated by the teacher, that there were high levels of participation, which did not mean that every student talked as much as every other student in every discussion, but that across the discussions over the course of the course, and some of these were semester long, some were year long, that there was a lot of participation by all students, and that didn't happen by accident. And finally, what we learned was that in these best practice discussions, that there was a real intensive focus on controversial issues. It wasn't something that students did once or twice during the course, but it was something that students had a lot of practice with. Well, with all of those findings, especially when we looked at what happened longitudinally, we kind of learned a variety of things that are represented here. And let me just start at the bottom. Students who were in the best practice classes reported that they were more likely to intend to vote in the future and actually were more likely to vote. They were more interested in politics and they more frequently followed the news. They had a higher level of general knowledge about government. They reported that they were more likely to talk about politics and about controversial issues socially with their friends and with their family, that they began to believe that it was important to hear diverse views before making a decision, that they reported that they were in classroom climates where they felt like their views were respected, and that the teacher in particular really wanted students to feel like their views mattered, that they found the discussions highly engaging and valuable to their learning, and last but not least, that they saw themselves as learning within a democratic community. Now, with what we learned from the political classroom, Paula and I, a couple of years ago at the University of Wisconsin, started building a new project called the Discussion Project, which is a project that teaches higher ed instructors, faculty, and staff how to have high quality discussions in their classrooms. Those of you who have a lot of experience in higher education know that many people come into higher education with much less preparation to be teachers than is the case K-12. So in the Discussion Project, we're really going down to the basics in lots of ways. We've now, with that project, turned it into a virtual project. So we're teaching teachers or higher ed instructors virtually how to have these discussions. And we're just starting about a month ago to develop a high school version of the Discussion Project, which we hope that we will roll out nationally in a couple of years. So let me end by saying that at the conference that we had about a month ago, where we gave out these t-shirts, the front of them, as I said to you, said, "Teach like democracy depends on it." And the back said, "Because it does." And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think we've got time for some questions. And what I would encourage you to do, if I could ask David or whomever's controlling this to unfreeze the chat. And if you have a question, if you could just type it into the chat. If you could also tell me what your name is, that would be helpful. So let's just take a pause here while you have a chance, if you have a question or a comment or a concern or a criticism, to please put it into the chat.
And it looks like the chat's ready to go, so ask away. Thank you so much. It was fantastic, Diane.
Yes, if everybody wants to unmute and unvideo for a moment so you can do a round of applause, then we'll take questions as they pop up. But I definitely want to thank Diana.
Absolutely.
This has been wonderful. I also, if I can get everybody's picture on here, I'll take a screenshot, which I'm so excited I'm learning how to do screenshots. You know, if we stay virtual for a long enough time, I will actually not be such a disaster. So if any other people want to be in the picture.
It's all right. My hair's a mess.
I'm sorry. That's okay. All right. But if we have questions. And Diana, the one question I'm going to start you with is, how much pushback do you get when you go to schools and say that this should be taught?
You know, that's a great question. I don't hear a lot of pushback. What I hear, I hear two big concerns. One is that even though we've been politically polarized for a long time, it seems like what's going on now is different by some order of degree. That, you know, this is a really, really tense election. This is a really, really hard political time. Not just because of polarization, but I think the pandemic has made this more challenging. I think the fact that we actually have twin pandemics. We've got the pandemic caused by COVID-19. We've got a social pandemic caused by racial injustice. And I think that those, all of those factors combined make this a very more difficult time to do this kind of work than it's been in the past. What I hear from parents is that they do not want teachers indoctrinating their students. What I believe is that there are very few teachers who are actually doing that. I mean, I hear and see very few examples of that. But I think that there are occasionally examples of that, and those examples get magnified. And it causes people to think that this is just widespread, that in fact, it's impossible for a teacher to engage students in discussions of politics without the teacher trying to foist her or his or their own views on students. And so I think one of the things that's really important in this work is that school administrators have to know what teachers are doing and why. And we have to really work with school administrators so they have teachers' backs, so they support teachers in doing this work. That's one thing. I think the second thing is that teachers have to communicate with parents. Even teachers who are teaching juniors and seniors in high school, I think have to communicate with parents differently now than in the past. And they have to make sure that parents know why they're doing this and how it relates to what we know from research about how we build people who want to be politically engaged. And I think one of the things that's challenging, and I hear this all the time now, is that when people are teaching virtually, they have parents in their classroom. And they have, aunts and uncles and grandparents and siblings. And so you're teaching not just to that student, you might be teaching to the whole family. And I think it's really important for people to realize that. And again, to be even more transparent than we've been in the past about why we're doing this.
So we're getting a lot of stuff now in chat, Diana. Sarah Brooks, if you want to ask your question, Sarah, just jump in and ask it.
So I've noticed that when students are willing to share aspects of their own identity, be it like their gender identity, political identity, religious identity, what have you, in class, I tend to notice there's a bit of a culture shift in the class, and the conversations that would occur around controversial issues seem a little bit more careful and also richer. So I just wondered, do you encourage that in some way? Is that some aspect of prep for conversation around controversial issues? Would you discourage it? Are there ways you would advise encouraging it?
Wow, Sarah, that's a great question. I see the same thing, that in classes where there's a really good classroom climate and there's a high level of trust among students and between students and the teacher, that students are more willing to disclose things about themselves that make the discussions richer. Here would be an example in Ms. Heller's class, when the students were deliberating the death penalty in the legislative simulation. One student said that he didn't believe that the death penalty should be banned because he thought life imprisonment was way too easy. And another student stood up and said that she knew that life imprisonment was nothing remotely easy. And she knew that because both her father and brother were in prison for life, which I was just astonished that she said this. And it had a dramatic impact on the conversation. It didn't mean that every student agreed with her views on the death penalty, but it really did have an impact, I think, in a positive way. And Sarah, as you're suggesting, I think, when students share things about themselves, that can be helpful. That being said, I think there's a difference between students feeling safe enough that they want to share something about themselves and students sharing that because their teacher has explicitly asked them. I would never, as a teacher, for example, say, tell me what religion you are. Well, maybe I would in some private schools, but I wouldn't do that in a public school. And I certainly would be very, very careful about asking students to disclose things about their gender identity. So I think what the teachers should do is develop a climate where students feel like they can share important things about themselves without teachers asking students things that I think they really shouldn't be requiring students to say. There's an awful lot of things that influence how we believe or what our beliefs are about political issues. And a lot of those things, are not apparent. We just certainly wouldn't know them unless students shared them. So Sarah, I really appreciate that question. And my sense is that it really looks different in different kinds of classrooms, and that trust and respect are the two key things.
Thank you.
You had a question just about how do you overcome apathy among 18-year-olds? What's your idea?
Well, it's one thing that I'm noticing is a lot less apathy than I think people often tend. I think there is this kind of trope that students are apathetic and they don't care about anything. I don't, that may be happening in some places. I can tell you, I'm certainly not seeing that here in Madison, Wisconsin. where we've had protests this summer with, 4,000 and 5,000 people in the streets, and many of them were, 16, 17, 18-year-olds and younger. So I think that, there's certainly some students who are apathetic, but I actually think that we've got more interest among young people in the political system than I've seen in a long time. But to give a really specific answer, I think that apathy is often caused by lack of knowledge. It's hard to care about something if you don't know about it. And one of the things that teachers can do is make sure that students are really familiar with what's happening politically. And the more familiar they are with what's happening politically, the more likely they are to care about it.
Kevin, do you want to ask your question, Kevin Wagner?
Mine was a little bit off the beaten path in that I teach AP research to seniors at the high school level. And there are quite a few students, as you can imagine, this year who are going down a political research path or a social justice path. And I was just curious to ask you any little tips or tricks maybe for them as a student researcher, because a lot of them are doing surveys and they don't want to guide the people to the answers that they want to hear.
Yeah. Well, let me say, Kevin, I'm really glad you're doing that. I think it's really important. Is there an AP stats teacher in your school?
There is, yes. And we kind of require them to take that if they're doing AP research too.
That's great, because I think that, it's really, really important, more important than ever, I think, for students to really have a solid education in statistics. I don't know how many of you spend any time on the website 538, but I can tell you I spend a couple hours a day on it, and it's all about political polling. And, you really have to understand at least basic statistics to understand how political research works. So I'm thrilled that students are taking that as well. Let me just say this, it's really hard to learn how to write survey questions. I'm a survey researcher, and I can tell you, this is something that people do for a living. Like, even though I use survey research in my own research, I hire people who, they have been trained in how to write questions, because it's very, very hard to do this. So one thing I would suggest to your students is that there are a lot of existing high quality survey questions that are worth using. Pew, for example, the Pew website has phenomenal questions, and that they can probably learn as much about research without writing survey questions as they can by writing their own survey questions. Now, it may be that you've got a learning outcome that students learn how to write surveys, in which case you've got to teach them how to do that. But I think it may be that you really want students to get data, and to get high quality data, and to learn how to analyze data, and therefore starting with questions that are already high quality questions that have been field tested. I kind of argue with people on our campus about this all the time, because people want to survey students now during the pandemic about everything, which is fine. We need a lot of data about how our students are experiencing this, but they often have people who are not survey researchers writing these questions, and the questions, bad questions produce bad data. Then we have bad data and we get bad policy. So that would be my answer to you, but bravo for doing that. I think it's great.
Thank you very much.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions if people want to jump in.
David, can I just make a statement?
Go, Mark.
I posted a couple of messages on the chat board. National Council for the Social Studies has a list of communities, and one of them is Issue-Centered Education. I've been on that community for about the last 20 years with Ron Evans and a group of younger teachers since there. And there is a body of literature that is out there that you should take a look at concerning curriculum and the classroom atmosphere.
Thanks, Mark. I kind of was, grew up in the issue-centered social studies world. When I started teaching in Downers Grove in 1979, I was taught by people who had been taught by Fred Newman, who of course was founders of issue-centered social studies. And, one of the things that I think is really important is for teachers to realize that we've got good, high quality curriculum, and they don't have to write it themselves. I mean, this is one of the challenges that I think there is this sense that, in order to be a good teacher, you have to write your own curriculum. There's absolutely no evidence behind that. As a matter of fact, the teachers in our study who were the strongest teachers were not writing their own curriculum. What they were doing was finding high quality curriculum that was being written by people who that's what they did for a living. So for example, I'm looking at Candace's statement here, the difference between constitutional and political issues. And yes, they are very different. They need to be taught differently. There's different learning outcomes, et cetera. And there's different high quality curriculum about political compared to constitutional issues. I'm, a huge fan of street law. They have really great curriculum writers, and they both have political issues, curriculum, and legal and constitutional issues. But there's other groups as well. Procon.org was just purchased by Encyclopedia Britannica, and they're going to continue to offer their curriculum free. Stanford, which has had a history group that's for years developed high quality curriculum, is now developing civics curriculum. Constitutional Rights Foundation has great curriculum. Mikvah Challenge has great curriculum. Brown, Choices for the 21st Century. So I think the best thing we can do as teachers is to find high quality curriculum and use it instead of staying up till midnight every night trying to write our own. One of the things that Steve Klein and I learned at the Constitutional Rights Foundation is that really high quality curriculum takes a long time to write. It's got to be very carefully researched. You've got to make sure that it is, high quality in every way. It's got to be field tested, and that's just not something that most teachers have time to do.
So Diana, we're going to end in just a moment. Is there any last words other than how can we all get a t-shirt, which is the question everybody will want to know. But are there any last words 10 days away from the election for teachers who want to be teaching this stuff?
Teach about it. I know it's hard, but this is probably the most important election we've had in this country in 100 years. And we really want to make sure that everybody understands what's happening. And it's hard to teach about something that is in real time, I know, but there's really good work done on how to teach about elections. There's really good curriculum that's out there. So I would just encourage everybody to, quite literally stop what you're doing and spend 2 weeks teaching about the election, and then plan on spending another week or so after the election, because I think we could be having another Bush v. Gore-like situation where it might be several days or even a couple weeks before we know the results of this election. You're living in an incredibly important state, obviously. And because of that, there's a huge amount of political communication and lots of political ads in Pennsylvania. One of the things that's interesting is that if you go into states that are, really blue or really red, there are no commercials, unless they're commercials for like Senate candidates or something like that. The big political ad money is in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin, in Florida, in all these big battleground states. So you, like we here in Wisconsin, are really in an important place for this election. And I encourage you to teach about it. With respect to the t-shirts, David, why don't we talk about that offline? I'm happy to come up with a way of providing you t-shirts at cost if you want to distribute them to teachers in some way. The School of Education has all sorts of fun swag. And for 2 years, I've been saying, let's do an online store where we can sell this stuff, not because we want to make money so much, but because some of it's really fun. We actually have a School of Education onesie for babies. And all sorts of different kinds of t-shirts. But what I found is during the middle of a pandemic, when you turn to your staff and say something like, how about creating an online store? They kind of look at you like, seriously? So we haven't done that yet, but hopefully we will at one time. But anyway, let me just thank you so much for inviting me to participate this morning. I want to thank you all for the work you're doing. Those of you in higher ed who are teaching the next generation of teachers, thank you so much. Those of you who are teaching, what you're doing now is, I would argue, more important than it's ever been. I mean, I really believe that t-shirt is right, that we do have to teach like democracy depends on it, because I really think it does. So with that, I'm going to sign off. I'm going to thank my good friends in Pennsylvania for inviting me. It was great to see all of you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you so much, Diana.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And Sarah, if you would stop the recording.